Well, just a moment, guys. Some issue with the almost there. Okay, we are live.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Facing Racism in Our Faith Communities. My name is Suzanne Jansen. I'm the editor of Living City magazine. Today's webinar is sponsored by Living City magazine and New City Press. It is part of our Dare to Care webinars, where we're trying to understand together how to face the challenges our nation is going through individually and in our communities. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "Our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization." While grappling with racism in our justice and healthcare system, in economics and education, we cannot close our eyes to its presence in our faith communities. We have to face the history of racial injustice in our churches or religious communities. For today's webinar, we plan to have 3 panelists, but one of them, Chelsea Tibbett, cannot make it. She is a nurse and she is working at a COVID-19 testing site in Massachusetts. She organized everything to be off for the webinar, but then a nurse got sick and she has to work. So she is putting the webinar's motto, Dare to Care, into practice. Let me present our 2 panelists briefly. Dr. Ansel Augustine is a New Orleans native who presently works as the Executive Director of Cultural Diversity and Outreach for the Archdiocese of Washington. He has worked in ministry for over 20 years, mostly in his hometown of New Orleans. Dr. Carey Latimore is an associate professor of history at Trinity University. He is the former chair of the history department and co-chair of the African American Studies program. He holds an Master and a PhD in American history from Emory University. And he is an expert on African American communities from Reconstruction through the Civil Rights era. Thank you for being here with us today. I want to start with the question for Ansel. In every aspect of society, you can find examples of Black lives being undervalued, and the church is no exception. Ansel, you have intensely studied and reflected on the history of Black Catholics. Could you share with us a bit about the history of racism inside the Catholic Church?
Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you're watching every webinar. It's a to be here. When we look at the term of racism within or outside of the Catholic Church and how it has affected people, especially Black Catholics, and I want to specifically focus on African American Catholics during my remarks during this webinar, it has been a challenge. When we look at the brokenness of human nature, wherever you find humans, you tend to find sin. That's why we have the beautiful sacraments in our church to help us make us right with our faith. Also, the sacrifice of Jesus himself was to make humanity right because of that original sin of our foreparents, Adam and Eve. And so when we look at the document that the bishops just put out, Open Wide Our Hearts, talking about racism, they refer to racism as America's original sin. And the effects of that still haunt us and affect us today. Black Catholics have been a part of this church since its founding, but especially here in the Americas. You know, when we look at cities like St. Augustine, Florida, Los Angeles, Chicago, even other dioceses around the country, there were enslaved and free people of color that were part of that process. In a story, you know, on a previous webinar of how that affected me personally. You know, Teen Cross. This is my church right here behind me, back home, St. Peter Claver in New Orleans, which is in Treme, which is known as the oldest Black neighborhood in the country, where free people of color were allowed to buy land. And out of that, you know, this is where jazz comes from. Also, the earliest parts of the civil rights movement occurred here in my neighborhood. And Homer Plessy was a Black Catholic at St. Augustine Church, which is just a couple of blocks from my church. You know, and the history that plays out there. Even Mother Henriette DeLille, one of the 6 African Americans on the road to canonization, grew up in this area. So there's a rich history here. So we are proud of who we are as Black people, but also whose we are as Catholic people. And that is expressed. So the challenge that happened was after Hurricane Katrina, which ravaged our city, I was working for the Archdiocese of New Orleans in the youth ministry office, helping to diversify the programming that was there, because many of our Black Catholic churches and our growing Hispanic population and our Vietnamese population that's here in New Orleans were not a part of the youth ministry outreach or programming of the diocese. So there's one particular time where our group, Teen Cross, which was the Archdiocesan Youth Board, would meet. We would meet at one of the churches in the suburbs because of Katrina. That was the only place that was available for us to meet, 100 or so of us members of this youth board. And any of the Black parents that would send their children to be a part of this would say they were only going to go if they came with Mr. Ansel. That was what I was referred to at the time. So I would pick up the kids in my vehicle from the Black Catholic high schools. One in particular was our all-male Black Catholic high school, St. Augustine High School, founded by the Josephites. And so I would pick up the boys, and then we would get something to eat and go to the meeting. Well, this meeting in particular, we had to go early because the volunteer that normally comes to set up the building, the tables and chairs for the meeting, couldn't come get off work. He worked at a hospital at the time. And so I would pick this one meeting. I picked up the boys early from St. Aug in their Catholic school uniform, and me in my Archdiocesan polo, and went to the church to open up and set up for the meeting. So when we got to the hall, I put the key in the door. And as soon as I was starting to unlock the door, this white lady, a church member, I'm assuming, came from around the corner of the building and asked who we were and started grilling us with all these questions, telling her I'm a diocesan representative. I'm telling her that these are young people from our Catholic school, that they just picked up. They were in school uniform, didn't believe us. And she immediately threatened to call the police. Mind you, we were in the suburbs. You know, everywhere else in the world, y'all say counties. In Louisiana, we say parishes. So we were in Jefferson Parish, which is outside of Orleans Parish. And there's a reputation in Jefferson Parish with the police and the minorities, specifically African-American males. And so immediately we froze. I didn't know what to do because I didn't want the police to come, because who would they believe? What would be the outcome? God forbid. Well, about maybe a minute later, the man, volunteer that was supposed to come early, a white male, showed up in his scrubs, hospital scrubs, and he was like, "What's the problem?" And her only response was, "Are they with you?" And he was like, "Yes," and she walked off. And the way we found out they didn't know each other, this was their first time meeting, was the volunteer asked us, "Who is she?" Well, we were quiet, and of course we set up and everything. And that, unfortunately, because of that reality, that was the last time these young men came to a Teen Cross meeting. Because of that, their safety was a concern. And unfortunately, I did not really have that person. My supervisor understood as best as he could, but he couldn't relate because he didn't understand that safe space, the church, which we are members of. He didn't belong there. And that was a reality. So when we look at the challenges of church and brokenness still affects us, and the original sin of racism, as the bishops call it, still affect us as church people today.
Thank you, Ansel. I would invite everyone, if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. So Carey, besides being a historian, you are also a Baptist minister for over 20 years. Could you outline for us the journey of segregation and racial discrimination in your church? Are there signs for reconciliation?
Suzanne, that's a very good question. I'm going to do my best to get it to you as succinctly as possible. I think the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about is the differences within the church structure of a Baptist and a Catholic. As a Baptist, we are congregational in our church structure. And so each congregation is its own basically political entity. So we choose our pastors, we choose the kinds of things in the church, and we don't have a more Episcopal structure kind of designating things in that way. And so that's why you have so many Baptist churches, because we divide off kind of the way that things are. But I think that that helps us get to the point of how you have so many Baptist churches and how race really can involve itself in a strong way within the church structure. So if we come back to the 1700s, which is when the Black Baptist church really started to emerge, the time period of the Great Awakening, which is the 1730s, 1740s, it reaches down into the South. Really, you start to see in the 1770s, 1780s, some African Americans being converted to this more evangelical faith. If you think about it beforehand, you do have organizations like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, which was an Anglican mission, which did some good work. But really, you had a very hierarchical church structure, and a lot of African Americans were not converting to the faith. But with the Great Awakening, you had a larger influence on a dismantling of hierarchy, a desire to move the church back to its roots, really what you see in the Acts of the Apostles. You also see a church allowing for Black ministers. They don't have to be educated in the same kind of way. You see people having religious services out in fields. I mean, George Whitefield went out in fields and preached in that way, and people were expressing themselves and joyful about it and praying and really being convicted in the spirit. But the breakdown of that hierarchy had a social impact on the ground. So if you have a church that's saying that you don't have to be educated to be a minister, or you can start your own churches, on the ground, that can have an impact on issues of slavery. And so the early Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians were a little more radical than, say, the Anglicans or, say, the Puritans. They were somewhat outlaws in a sense. And some of them who decided to join these denominations did face some discrimination. And so early Baptists, early Methodists, and some early Presbyterians were anti-slavery. And so with that, a lot of African Americans in the late 1700s and early 1800s started to convert to these faiths. As they convert, they, not surprisingly, start to want to have their own churches. And so we don't have a large church structure, as I was saying, but we do have associations. So associations accepted them. So you have the First Baptist Church of Williamsburg and other churches, and Blacks are able to be ministers at their churches and have it on their own. You also had denominations in the North that spread to the South, like the AME denomination, AME Zion. These are churches that kind of grow out of this period of religious awakening. But what eventually happens is that the Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians go more mainstream in the early 1800s. And as they do so, the anti-slavery leanings of these denominations die out in a sense. And as they die out, you have a more pro-slavery advocacy out of Baptists and Methodists in the South. In the North, you have still some holdings on of the traditional anti-slavery attitudes. By the 1840s, those hold-ons are going to lead to a division really between Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists over the issue of slavery. And so you're going to have the Southern Baptist Convention. The Methodists in America are going to split. The Presbyterians are going to split all over the issue of slavery. Now, where do Blacks fit into this? They've got their AME denomination, but within the Baptist church, as these splits happen, more Southern states start to put more restrictions on Black preaching. So as in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Blacks could be ministers. In my home state of Virginia, after Nat Turner's Rebellion, it was not legal for Blacks to be ministers. They could be a part of a church, they could pray in a church, but that church had to be led by a white man. And so you have tremendous restrictions on Black churches, not in all states, by the way, but in Virginia, you have these restrictions that really restrict how much mobility Blacks have, but African Americans do want to serve in their individual churches. Why? It gives them more freedom. That's why you have the AMEs. But it also gives them a space that they can really do things on their own and show themselves as a worthy community. And that's what they want to do. The doctrine is really the same, but kind of the social aspects are gradually growing different. The Black church is going to be abolitionist strongly, North and South. The white churches in the North is going to be more anti-slavery. In the South, it's going to be pro-slavery. So that's a difference. After slavery, those restrictions against Black ministers are done. And so you have more African Americans coming out of slave churches, forming their own congregations. And I'll give you an example from my home church in Virginia. My ancestors attended a church called Clark's Neck, which is a church that, it was a white church, but slaves attended that church. After slavery, 3 men were ordained and licensed in that church with the idea that they would go and create their own church. And this is what happens in the South throughout, is that you have a lot of African Americans coming out of these plantation churches or integrated churches, forming their own churches, intentionally because they want that, but also because perhaps those churches are pushing them out in a sense as well. And so then they will form their own associations, state associations and national associations, but maintaining the democratic nature of their Black Baptist churches. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention, lately in the last 20 years, has made some inroads among African Americans. A lot of African American churches are members of the Southern Baptist Association, but yet as Baptists, we can join a number of associations. And so we start to think about reconciliation. To a Baptist, is probably going to look a little bit different than it will look to a Catholic. We won't be looking at doctrinal statements as much as we'll be looking at individual relationships between churches, how on the local levels these churches start to work together. And I think we're starting to see that now, especially in the last month or so, or 2 months, as it seems that churches are having these kinds of conversations, but these are very hard conversations to have because they are rooted in historical aspects of discrimination, and they go back to the essence of who we are as Baptists, Methodists, or even Presbyterians.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your historical insights. Ansel, shifting from the past to the present, what can the Catholic Church do to work for racial justice? And what can be done on the parish level?
Okay. When we talk about the present, most of my work in ministry, although I have worked with adults throughout my time period, has focused, especially at my home church and beyond, has been focused on our youth and our young adults. If we look at what's going on around the world right now with, whether you want to call them a protest, whether you want to call them a gathering, whatever term you want to use, these are being organized and being led by youth and young adults of those areas because they want to see a just society. They want to see a world that is better than the one that they're in, not only for them, but for those that are coming after them. And sometimes when I deal with our adults in ministry, God bless them, this is not a knock on adults. I have to check myself too, is the fact that sometimes we just get comfortable with what is, but there's a passion and a fire in our youth and young adults. So my first challenge or even opportunity for our parishes on a parish level is to hear and listen from your youth and young adults, not only in your church, but in your community. Let me say that again, not only in your church, but in your community, because that's where a lot of the partnerships and relationships are. What I found in our church is there's that disconnect, that generation gap, but also that cultural gap. Sometimes when we look at our Catholic churches, especially, sometimes they get caught off guard if they're not already in the social justice movements, which a lot of our Black Catholic churches are, or a lot of our multicultural churches are. There's already those connections and relationships already there. But if they are not, there's an opportunity to be a part of that work. As we say, #dare to care. Dare to care enough to what is going on in the community around you, even if it's not your own issues or problems. Last night, I was on the phone with my mentor, my former supervisor, Auxiliary Bishop of New Orleans, Bishop Ferdinand Cherie. And we were talking about his upcoming speech that he's supposed to give to the National Gathering of Catholic Major Superiors, I believe is the title of the conference. And during that conversation, he was told about when he made a statement following the murder of George Floyd. When he made a statement, the next day he got a call from a white woman he perceived who it was. When he asked what parish it was, she was very open to say this. And she read, I guess, some rap sheet that they got of all the negative things George Floyd might have done in his life. And thus she said it was justified, his murder. And Bishop Cherie, his words to her, and this is being his speech, and he said I could share this, was, I the same video. I saw it. If you are a pro-lifer, you don't get to pick and choose what pro-life issues to defend. Either you are or you are not for life. He said there was dead silence and no response. And so for us as Catholics, and especially connecting with what our parishes can do and connecting with our young people, be prepared for the tough questions. Our young people and our young adults are not playing anymore and not going to accept just because this is what was said or this is what has been done. They want to know why, and they're willing to work to make the changes happen. They want to know why there are separate Catholic churches. Why is there a Black Catholic church? Why is there a white Catholic church a couple of feet maybe away? You know, why are these the realities in our churches, and how do we address and create the change so that we can truly be one body of Christ, not erasing anybody's culture? Because 9 times out of 10, when we come together as church folk, it's usually the minority group that has to give up their way of doing things to be accepted in the norm. But how do we accept the other cultural reality as part of those norms and to be a part of those discussions? For me personally, as a resource that we created, started 4 years ago and it came out 2 weeks ago, is the website www.blackfaithmatters.com, which talks about a reality. It's just one unique story. As my brother said before, Black people, we are not a monolithic people. You know, not every Black Catholic church worships the same way mine does in New Orleans with the gospel choir and the Afrocentric art and different ways of expressing our faith. But this story that's in there in that 17-minute documentary that we started working on 4 years ago with Spirit Jew Studios, who put it all together, is to share a story of why our Black Catholic young adults are finding it hard to even remain in the Catholic faith, and why those of us that are trying to fight to keep them there are having such a struggle in our own ways and trying to receive that recognition and support from the church. So what can our parishes do right now? Connect and listen to the youth in their parish and the community.
Thank you to reminding us that we have to face these challenging questions. And also thank you for the resources. We will put together at the end of the webinar all these resources and send it out via email. Carey, as a professor of African American history, you are immersed in the study of the lights and shadows that have built this nation since its birth. What do you think is the best way we can respond to the need being expressed by many to remove symbols of slavery represented in concrete statutes throughout the country?
That's a very difficult question. It's a very complex question. And I am a Southerner. I grew up in Virginia. I saw a lot of monuments growing up. I live in an area where my ancestors most likely were enslaved. It is part of who I am. It's something that I cannot change. And it's an identity within me that is very complex and peculiar. I cannot divorce myself from the institution of slavery, nor would I want to, because a lot of who I am is because of that experience. And it was a wrong experience, but it has created who I am. Blood ties, all of those things, it was part of that. When we deal with a monument, and I think the most issue was about monuments, I like to think about 3 questions. And the first question is, who is represented? The second question is what time was this monument constructed? And 3, is it possible for us to know the intentions of the people who created the monument? Because not all monuments mean the same thing, and not all representations are just a representation of one person. There are some monuments that are created really to underpin or highlight the idea of the lost cause, the idea that went throughout the South that the Civil War was not about slavery and all of this kind of stuff. And so it was meant to kind of pursue a certain ideology. But I think that anytime we look at monuments, we also have to think about the idea of dialogue. I do not support the idea of just desecrating a monument because I think about solutions, and those solutions in my mind require conversation, because it doesn't change a person's heart that may support that monument to see someone desecrate it or pull it down. It doesn't change the reasons for that monument. It doesn't make us feel better, nor does it change my life for that monument to not be there. But at the same time, if we keep a monument, for me, we cannot let them stand without any explanation of what they are. So at the very least, there needs to be a definition or understanding or a placement of what this monument is to the best of our historical understanding. At the same time, we need to have a conversation about what these monuments mean in the context today. And 3, if you want to keep that monument, you better be willing to study that person. I mean, let me come back to this. Does the fact that a person sided with the Confederacy during the war mean that any monument of them has to be removed? Does that take into consideration things that they may have done after the war? So Nathan Bedford Forrest, no. He started the Klan after the war. We know where his trajectory went. But there are other people who, maybe if they started an African-American school, maybe if they did other things, does that mean that a choice that they made when they were young or that they were conscripted into mean that that statue has to go? So for me, it's always about more dialogue and understanding, but also, I don't think that we face more issues in America as African Americans than just a monument. And taking down a monument may make people feel good, but systemic racism still exists. The issues that created George Floyd and all the others are still there. And I worry that just a monument gone, people might think that that's changing the whole dynamic, when the reality is that part is endemic into American society. The question is, what do we do to change and have true change, and to not just do cosmetic things in my mind? So bottom line, some monuments probably need to go, but I would like to do it in a more conversational aspect than a way in which it antagonizes both sides. I want us to find ways to come together, and then we can start doing real change, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. And as I mentioned before, please make sure to ask your questions in the Q&A box for our panelists. Ansel, you just started your new job as Executive Director of Cultural Diversity and Outreach for the Archdiocese of Washington. So how can the Catholic Church, being multi-ethnic, how can the Church become more aware of its rich tradition, particularly Black culture and Black spirituality?
Okay, during my conversation last night with Bishop Cherie, we reflected on this quote from Sister Thea Bowman, who was able to address, I believe it was 1989, the USCCB at their meeting. And her words were this: what does it mean to be Black and Catholic? It means that I come to my church fully functioning. I bring myself, my Black self, all that I am, all that I have, all that I'm worth, all that I hope to become. I bring my whole history, my traditions, my experience, my culture, my African-American song, movement and teaching and preaching and healing and responsibility, gift to the church. So how do we, family, how do we create those opportunities where we see Black Catholicism as a gift? Here in the Archdiocese, here when the quarantine started, so I haven't really seen the archdiocese, but meetings via Zoom and other gatherings. We're looking at inside the chancery, how diverse are we as a makeup and representative of the people that we serve in the archdiocese? The priests, how is their training in the seminary? Deacons as well. Looking from top down, but also creating opportunities to have those listening sessions where people learn more about each other. You know, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once said, and I'm paraphrasing, the most segregated time in our country is Sunday morning when we're at church, you know, and that still remains true. So how can we have those interactions for us and educate our people? You know, we do not have an African-American Catholic saint yet in the church, yet we have 6 on the road to canonization. I mentioned 2 of them already, Sister Thea Bowman, who I just quoted, and Mother Henriette DeLille from my neighborhood here in Tremay, you know, and the other 4, you know, represent different parts of the country, you know, and their story is truly a Black Catholic story where they have felt they were faced with all kinds of obstacles and obstructions, but yet they continued to choose to overcome, to live out their faith, and saw dignity in themselves and the community that they were called to serve, despite being thought of as less than human. So for us to understand that story and to understand those gifts, and to also wrestle, as we see playing out with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., the ugly history of our Catholic Church, the humanness of our Catholic Church at times, the religious orders that owned and sold slaves, the segregation that happened, even the racist history of some of our clergy that may have run off people from the church or created these divisions that still hurt today, because there are elders that are still alive today that still feel pain from things that happened to them when they were younger or their families. And so for even those understandings to hear those truths, to hear those stories so that we can create true healing. So many times I've told some of my colleagues in the youth ministry and other ministry circles that many times I feel the Black Catholic community, specifically the African-American Catholic community, has had to be the thorn in the side of, and sometimes the conscience of our Catholic Church, calling us to task for things that they have done and have not done. And so how do we come together using our faith, using our traditions, using us and seeing us as gifts, as Sister Thea Bowman said, so that we can truly be one body of Christ?
Thank you, Ansel. There's still so much to discover. Thank you for sharing this. Carey, you already mentioned dialogue as a means to understand our history better. So how can ecumenical outreach and interreligious dialogue be another path towards social healing? What have been the challenges and opportunities along this journey?
Ecumenical dialogue is very important to me for obvious reasons. My wife is Catholic and I'm Baptist. And our marriage, I think, is made stronger by our differences. She also happens to be Filipino and I'm African-American. But yet we find ways that we are extraordinarily similar. I don't have a problem going into a Catholic church and worshiping at a Catholic church. She doesn't have a problem coming to a Baptist church. And there are some differences, but we appreciate them and it helps us to learn more about who we are. Going to a Catholic church strengthens my identity as a Baptist. I believe that her coming to a Baptist church strengthens her identity as a Catholic. And that's how I want it to be. Neither one of us wants to see the other one convert and change the underpinnings of who we are as an individual. And so ecumenical conversations are extraordinarily important. Interracial conversations are important. The problem that I think that we have in our society is that we sometimes only want to talk to people who agree with us. And so Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram, all of these venues of communication have allowed us to cancel people with whom we disagree. And then we have a society in which we don't have difficult conversations. I'll be honest. I think when I grew up, we actually had more conversations about race than we do today. Although if you take out this last moment of the last 2 months, I have students who are afraid to even use the word African-American. Instead, I had the student come in one time and said, Dr. Latimore, the people that you talk about in the class and the situations that they went to, those people and just kept on going. I said, who? She said, well, those people. And then she pointed to me and said, people like you. I said, African American? She said, is it okay if I say African American? I don't want to offend. I said, well, the title of the class is African American Experience, but we have created a scenario in our society where we are so afraid to communicate, and we only want to communicate with people with whom we agree. So if we disagree with somebody, we cancel them on Facebook. But interracial, interreligious, ecumenical conversations are always going to help us be stronger. It will make the Baptist Church stronger to have relationships with the Southern Baptist Church. It will make the Catholic Church stronger to have relationships and to acknowledge that Catholic, that Black Catholic past, and acknowledge the racial issues within that. It would help us to have conversations, Black and white and Latino and Asian, about issues of systematic racism and understanding maybe we don't all have the same path, but we can each other help the other person understand that path. Sometimes our problems are problems of not understanding. My wife doesn't understand racism in the same way because she grew up in the Philippines. I couldn't just say, well, she doesn't understand racism, and she talks about being colorblind, and there's no such thing as a colorblind person. Well, I had to understand where she approaches that, and she had to understand where I approach that. In the same way, white Southerners and Black Southerners have a similar background, but they learn to talk about race in different kinds of ways. As a Black Southerner, I have to find ways to approach a white Southerner who grew up in a different environment, even though we grew up in the same environment, on those issues. And so that's where the difference allows us to be better. The idea of diversity, it doesn't mean that you become one. It means that you take the differences and you create something even better. And I think that's what religious dialogue does. It takes the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Catholics, and we put it together and we get something even better out of it. But yet we maintain our own identity. And I think that's the beauty of interracial dialogue. And I think on issues of race, only that will get us to where we want to. It just can't be Black people leading the charge against systematic racism. It's got to be all of us, because we're 13, 14% of the population. What can we do on our own? We've been doing that for the last 200 years. But if we come together and we communicate together and we listen together, then I think that creates the opportunity where we do some really good work together.
Great, thank you. So I think this stirred up a lot of conversation, a lot of question maybe. I will pass on now to Greg, Marketing Director of New City Press, for the Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to both of our panelists for getting off to such a really good start and engaging in such a good discussion. We are going to try to open things up now more widely to some of the questions that have come in the Q&A box, and thank you for all those questions. We will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm going to start with a South American who's an immigrant to the United States asked a question about the role of distinct parishes for different ethnic groups. That was something that was new to this person that they hadn't seen where they had grown up, but is here in the United States, which I think is true in both Protestant and Catholic settings. So you might both address this. Can these kind of parishes be helpful? Or may there also be potential drawbacks to that model? So if you might both just address the ethnic specific parishes and how that plays out. Thank you.
You want to start with that one?
All right. I guess because I have my parish in the back behind me. Parishes like mine, St. Peter Claver, came about. In fact, our church building, we made 100 years old today, not today, in 2020. We're celebrating our centennial anniversary as a parish. 1920, we became St. Peter Claver. In 1854 and was known as St. Anne's Catholic Church, a predominantly white Catholic church where we weren't allowed to attend. But then as the community and neighborhood in this part of Treme started transitioning and becoming more African American, the white folks left and built a church, St. Anne down the street, and this became our building. And the necessity of these churches to incorporate our culture, to hear and see, especially my community here at St. Peter Claver, the need for us to see Jesus and ourselves in Jesus, whether it's in the artwork, whether, as Sister Thea Bowman said, in the preaching, the gospel music, the way we interact with one another, and the way we are able to express ourselves in our own unique African-American Catholic tradition is important. In regards to this, not at all. Everybody is welcome. And I think when we look at the different parishes, sometimes people wonder, is this mean that this is a space that's only for the people that this parish or the expressions in this parish are for? No, all are welcome. And I think that's what some parishes, whether through segregation or even now, even in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, there are certain parishes, even as an Archdiocesan employee, I would be hesitant to go through or say some extra prayers before I attended, whether it was for a meeting or to attend Mass, because we weren't treated as being welcomed or, thought we were up to no good for attending. And those are the realities we have to understand. Yes, the different cultural expressions are important. And just as Carey said, the more we can connect with one another, and as Carey was talking about different places coming together and creating something new, it made me think of gumbo. I got hungry as you were talking about it, Carey. But I think for us, looking at our faith, these unique expressions are all expressions of God speaking through the culture, and the more we can connect, the more beautiful it will be. So these parishes are important as long as they're continuing to be welcoming of people of other faith and other backgrounds.
I would agree with Ansel 100%. And I think we also have to understand the history of those churches and the way that in American society, we've sometimes desegregated things. So let's take baseball. We're talking about religious issues, we're going to talk about baseball. So we hear the story, Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, but yet at the same time, that almost destroyed, and it basically did, Black Negro baseball and the money and the other kinds of things that revolved around it. And African Americans were not, for years, not equally allowed onto baseball teams. Most teams had one or two people. They had a quota of one or two Black people on those teams. And so the ways that we have sometimes desegregated and theoretically integrated, but desegregation is an instance of where you have a political process or where people are told to come together. Integration is a process by which people willingly come together. We've more desegregated than integrated. And so the question is, on what terms do we come together? I think historically, Black people created their own churches because they were not equal in the churches that they were coming out of. And so if you come together, it has to be done in an equal manner in which both groups don't compromise who they are. Now, we are the same Christ. God is not a respecter of persons, but we also have to realize that we live in a society in which human beings have created divisions between us. And that's what those churches reflect. And so those churches are also spaces where Black people found a way of doing things. They found pride in doing things their way. But if you think about the history, would Black people still be ministers in these larger churches? And how would the political structures end up? So I guess I'm saying, I wish that we could all come together in one. We are in one body in Christ, but the individual churches have been separated for a long time. How can we find ways that we can work together and still maintain those individual identities in which we still hold to very strongly and still be one body in Christ? And I think that comes through communication. And it also comes from people who love Christ, who want people who are in Christ to be as strong as they can be and be as fulfilled as they can be and worship in the way that they want to be, whether it's language, whether it's any of those things. The body of Christ is big enough to have all of those aspects and those ethnic identities. And we can be stronger by acknowledging those aspects of who we are.
Thank you both. And Carey, maybe this might be a good moment for a question that's kind of almost a follow-up to what you were just saying. A registrant asks, where within the Southern Baptist Church, if you could maybe point to some examples of where these uncomfortable conversations are beginning to take place. One of the one of the registrants was wondering for some examples of that. Thank you.
The Southern Baptist Convention, I think, has about 4,000 Black churches, and don't hold me to that number, that are members. And I know that there's a special commission within the Southern Baptist Convention that deals with issues of race. There's a guy named Russell Moore, who's a very prominent minister within the Southern Baptist Church, a white Southern Baptist who's taken on this kind of mantle of kind of a reconciliation. And so on that level, it happens through then. I know that there was also a statement that the Southern Baptists made some time ago talking about their historical backgrounds. But I think really, for me, it's the work that happens on the local levels in which you start to see Southern Baptist churches working with Black Baptist churches and at least starting a communication. Because I think in the Baptist structure, that's where the real change comes. You can have an edict that says that slavery was wrong, but unless if the individual people in locations work together, understanding it as a Baptist, that's not going to mean much until you have those local congregations that get together. And I think that's where we still have the most work to do. Because sometimes the ministers may want to do certain things, but the congregation doesn't want it. And in a Baptist church, if the congregation doesn't like it, the congregation can get rid of the minister and the pastor. So I think that committee on the Southern Baptist, and I will find the name for that, that's the area where much of that happens. And you have certain Southern Baptist leaders who are talking on that, and Black Southern Baptists who within that denomination have been working really hard to try to push it a little further to a more understanding position. Hope I answered that question.
Yeah, thank you. So Ansel, I just have one short clarification question that just came up a couple times in questions, and then a broader one after that. I think you had just mentioned there hasn't been an African-American saint. There have been African heritage saints, but not an African-American saint. Is that correct?
Yeah, not a continental United States born or raised African-American saints. And there are 6, like I said, that are being promoted for canonization.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Ansel, a specific question from a youth minister asking if you have some suggestions for resources, and again, we can share these, in an email afterwards, but if you thought it might be a moment to address that specifically for use with youth around these kind of conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would point everybody to, and I help put this, some of these resources together. Several of us that work in youth ministry from around the country put together resources on the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry website, different webinars and different documents that are out there. So the website, and I'm sure they'll email it out later, is www.nfcym.org, because these conversations are important. And there are discussion starters and just different other articles and resources that are out there. Some of the pastoral letters that have come out from all the different bishops around the country to help people understand that this is bigger than us. Also, and I saw it in the chat box as well, this is also a relevant topic for some of our youth ministry leaders that may be in non-diverse areas. I've had conversations with my colleagues in Helena, Montana. I just pick on Helena because that's what comes to mind, not to say that, but they said they want to have these conversations with our youth, but there's not Black Catholic parish, nfcym.org, I apologize, and not a Black Catholic parish in sight where they connect. So what I've suggested is either through appropriate media, which can be found on the website, or even books that are out there, you learn more about the faith and the experiences of Black folk and have those conversations. And also, like I said, I talked about the African-American Catholic experience, but that does not negate the contributions of our Hispanic brothers and sisters that identify in the African experience, the diaspora, or our Caribbean brothers and sisters, or even our brothers and sisters from the motherland of the continent as well. These are all unique Catholic perspectives that need to be taken into account. And I think Carey, my brother, said it best when he was talking about his wife. They are in the same place, but yet they negotiate with the world in different ways because of their background. And so too with our Hispanic brothers and sisters, our Caribbean brothers and sisters, and our brothers and sisters themselves, that these are different experiences that need to be understood by our Catholic Church. And I do not feel well equipped to speak for experience that isn't mine, even though there's Haitian roots in New Orleans, of course. But for us to understand and have these conversations. So these are different resources that were put on the NFCYM website that we curated. And I would ask you to check those out as well. And they're even good for adults as well, even though they're directed toward and from youth in that context.
That's really helpful. And that, I think, some people did have some questions about the parish as a whole for some models. And so we will for sure put some of those things together and send out in the follow-up email. And so we did have some, your first story really touched a number of people. Mm-hmm. And one writer, one person asked, do you have more to share on that encounter, and how did the follow-up, were there another piece to that maybe in the follow-up when someone was wondering? And then also, how has that shaped your sense of how, I guess someone was asking to reflect on how that kind of encounter might go differently, just as you've reflected on it over the years.
One, I don't know how that encounter could have gone differently. Thank God the police didn't show up. That's the only thing my prayer during that time was answered. I think for me, when I look at and a follow-up, the only follow-up I did, of course, was my supervisor spoke to the pastor of the parish, to see what meetings were going on. I never was told of any follow-up because most of my time was making sure the young men that were with me and the families that trusted those young men with me were taken care of pastorally, even though they chose not to come back. Still, there was a ripple effect, in our communities. Word of mouth is more powerful than, any other form of media. So, word of mouth was a deterrent to getting more young people from our Black Catholic community involved, because that space was not a safe space for us to be in. And so the numbers diminished until we moved to another site to meet. And that was an unfortunate reality. So for me, as someone that was quote unquote in the trenches and trying to create this opportunity for ministry to happen with our young people, because it wasn't the young people. And I can probably speak for every youth minister that's done youth ministry in some way, shape or form, whether it's from scouting, anywhere, you just name it. 90% of the problem are the adults, not the kids, and for me, I had to rebuild those bridges, even though they weren't really burnt, but we had to create opportunities for us to minister with our Black Catholic youth in our own safe spaces, and then bring them to these spaces in the future when the space in and of itself changed. So in regards to follow-up, I was really worried about the parents and the youth. I let my supervisor take care of the issue at the church because there was never any other things that could do. It was just the normal way of operating in the South at that time, and so for me, I was making sure the youth were safe. In regards to anything going different, I really don't know. Like I said, my only prayer is that the police didn't show up in any negative actions or any negative attitudes on my part, because I was upset and disturbed. And of course, these teenagers, these high school young men were upset that this was happening. Were upset as well. So who knows what would have came out if we were pushed to a certain degree in our righteous anger. So luckily that didn't happen. And so hopefully that answers the question.
Oh yeah, that's really, thank you so much for speaking so openly about that. And I think what we really capture and what both of you are sharing is really the evangelistic challenges that are presented by these kind of situations, and that your heart for the church is to really see people be able to encounter Christ. So along those lines, I wondered if you might, either of you, have some examples of some parishes where that you've seen kind of model this kind of dialogue and discussion within their parishes.
I guess I'll jump in. I remember after Hurricane Katrina, when we were doing this work, it wasn't necessarily parish-wide as much as diocesan-wide, and something that we're working for once things open back up here in the Washington area, is for us to have these listening sessions deanery-wide or vicariate-wide. It depends on what they say in the different dioceses around the country. But back home, the bishop or the auxiliary bishop attended these scheduled listening sessions where people came and expressed their frustration and anger, and concretely after the expressions of hurt and disrespect were shared, or even the tough questions of not understanding that racism is really an issue right now because that's not a person's lived experience or community's lived experience, to really concretely come together to address this issue as a diocese. So those listening sessions stand out. Even when we would bring youth groups together, whether a youth group from one of the suburbs would come visit our parish for mass, and or vice versa, we would create those partnerships. I've seen work, and that's really what we're trying to do, is help people understand each person's lived experience and story. And that's when we really come to a connection, because it might be different, but it is just as valid as someone else's. And I think that's what's important in addressing these issues. And that's where I've seen it work best, in those parish connections right there.
Thank you.
I'll give one example of where I thought something was really good. And it sounds very simple, but it was very profound to me. We had a relationship, the church that I attend now had a relationship with a white church, in which we had the birth of Christ and we acted it out. And so we went to their church and they presented it to us, and they came to ours and we presented it to them, and we had different mixes. But in one, we had a Black Jesus, and the other, we had a white Jesus. And I think that was the essence of all the historical things that we've dealt with on the representation. I think it was important for them to see that Jesus is for all of us. And for the churches to come together and to be celebrating together, to be worshiping together over this, to me, that broke down so many different barriers on a variety of subjects and issues, in that you could have others say, hey, we are praising him and we're celebrating him together, but the representation doesn't exactly look like me, and vice versa. But then to see that in one it does, in another it doesn't, I think that's the kind of conversations that make a profound difference. It did to me, and I know that it did to other people as well.
Thank you both. So Ansel had begun to touch on this. I don't know if you had seen the question itself, Ansel, but you had begun to talk some about the challenges, of this conversation, where it's specifically African-American, and then other folk that maybe from a Caribbean or Hispanic community, where do they fit into these conversations? And so that was one specific question that you had touched on some, and Carey, I was wondering if you might speak to that, how those histories are distinct, and yet there's also some overlap in terms of the way that people from other communities of color might also feel this racism playing out in their experience of parish life.
Can I get a little bit of the question? I think that, and I want to make sure that I'm clear, that the question is, how do other people who identify as Black find themselves as part of this larger conversation?
Yes, and unfortunately, it wasn't quite posed directly as a question, but I guess it was a feeling of just where you see those folk fitting in this conversation. They're not a part of the white community, but they're also not African-American community. As she says, her Blackness doesn't come from her U.S. roots. And so she's, in a sense, feeling left out on both sides of the dialogue.
I can certainly understand how she might feel left out, but I would also say that slavery and colonialism was an Atlantic world event. And so the same conditions that created the African-American experience that we see as African-American in the US is the same experience that she's in a sense coming out to, whether she's coming from South America, the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Cuba. There is a racial similarity, there is an ethnic similarity, and slavery in the Atlantic system, in the Atlantic slave trade, the triangular trade, created the same kinds of experiences. And so there may be some distinctions on whether you may see a tri-racial society. So as in most parts of the US, you really didn't have much of a tri-racial. When I say tri-racial, I'm talking about Blacks, whites, and gens de couleur, people of color. You have it in Louisiana, you have it in Mississippi, you have it in South Carolina, but you didn't have it as much in other areas. So there's, even in that Black American experience, there's diversity within that we sometimes have to get above. Many of my ancestors were slaves. Some of them were free African Americans. And so I think the Black experience is broad enough that it can bring them in. I know that it is. Sometimes we, and I'm including myself, may not do as good of a job as bringing that in, because it's not something that I have had to deal with as much growing up where I did, but it is an area where we should do a better job, because their experiences are extraordinarily similar, and yet different, but yet it builds the whole experience. Because, you know, even my wife, her experiences, even though she's not Black, colonialism created similar structures. And I think that that's something that we have to understand too, is that the people who are Black, who are talking about that Black experience from different nations, if you listen to them, those experiences are very similar. Colorism is very similar in all places that have issues with colonialism. So you could be from Vietnam and deal with that kind of an issue and understand color distinctions. And you may not define it as racial distinctions, but the definitions of power and who's in power and who's in control have had an implicit impact on our lives. And so that's the experience that we can have conversations about.
Yeah, and I echo that sentiment as well. There is work that needs to be done. And I would not want to speak for another culture that's not mine, but there are people that can speak for that better than myself. And there needs to be better attention, as Brother Carey said, on these issues that aren't our own. I remember when I started getting out of New Orleans more and more so after Hurricane Katrina, and even the experiences of our African-born brothers and sisters, and like I said, our Caribbean brothers and sisters that were here are different than mine, but are just as valid. You know, and I think, you know, how to get those voices at the table so that we are not competing with one another. Because just think about how different this conversation would be if we were more united in the struggle to address some of these ills that we all face. But yet, I think for what I'm saying in regards to the African-American experience, especially in the Catholic Church, there are still unresolved issues that we keep kicking the can down the road. And then there's a movement that we're seeing in front of us right now that people are freaking out because the can is being kicked back at them. And so how do we respond? So yes, these are issues that still need to be addressed, as my brother Carey said.
Yes, thank you both. I mean, for an hour long, we've been able to really get into a lot of things, but certainly there's so much more that we could talk about. And we do want to mention there were some additional questions about the whole monument question. And so maybe Carey will have some things to follow up with us in the email. So we don't want you all to feel like we didn't see those questions, but we also want to honor your time. So I want to say thank you. And I want to hand this over to Suzanne to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ansel and Carey, especially for your courage to speak so openly and for your clarity in pointing out the issues while we still have to learn so much, and also to enter in the dialogue, learning from each other, because this is the way to go. And I was really touched because I feel today's webinar was a step on this journey. So thank you to everyone also for the inspiring questions that engaged us in this dialogue. As we said, you will receive an email with the resources, and you could also watch the webinar again on our YouTube channel. Thank you to everyone and have a good day. Goodbye.